All right. Thank you, Daryl. And looks like we've got just about everybody here that was here for our morning session. So we're now going to get into the weeds and try and make some sense out of all of this so that you can take advantage of some of the newer technology that we hadn't introduced previously. The fact is, things like VoteScan have been around for 20 years. It was part of the original specification for the first generation NXDN radios. It's only been improved upon since that time. And as I said a moment ago, we now have enough repeaters in the area and enough demand that VoteScan and the ability to do auto channel steering in your radio now becomes a real option, a real possibility. So we're going to cover that. But let me start with the basics, because we're going to start here with a fresh slate, and I'm using the ICOM 2100 programming software, but what I'm going to show you is also available for the F4400, the F6400, the F62. It's basically pretty uniform across the board. So the first screen we're going to look at here is memory channel and zone operation. All right, we have not done anything in terms of defining any of our zones at this point, so we've got a fresh slate. And by default, you'll notice that under the zone type, it says conventional. And your radios at this point are programmed that way. They are all conventional zones. But if you click on this and edit, notice that we have three other options. We have a multi-site conventional, we have single-site trunking, which most of your radios will do, and then we have voting. And it's number 1 conventional versus number 4 voting that we're going to talk about right now. What's the difference? Well, with conventional, you put 2 or 3 or 5 or 20 memory channels into that zone. The only option you have to change channels is manually, either with the channel change knob on the top, or most of your radios are also equipped with a couple of side buttons. They're small, but right underneath the push to talk button on the left side of the radio. Now, if you have a need, and I saw one radio this morning that had more than 16 memory channels in the zone, you will need to be able to change channels either with the buttons that are on the front of your radio or the 2 side buttons that just automatically come programmed for channel up and channel down. Now, if that is the case and where you have more than 16 channels in a zone, you have the option to make your channel change knob on top go from changing channels to changing zones. So if you have a situation where maybe you've programmed a bunch of GMRS frequencies into the radio, or you've programmed more than 16 NXDN channels into a particular zone, you can go to the keys section, I'll show you that in a couple of minutes, and change the channel change knob from memory channel to zone, and then you can either use the side buttons for changing channels, or you can program one of the buttons or 2 of the buttons on the front of the radio to do a channel up, channel down. Just as you can program those buttons for channel up and channel down, you can also program them up for zone up and zone down, and that'll make navigating between your zones and your memory channels that much easier. Now, you've seen how we were able to change a zone from conventional to voting. So when your zone is voting, this will be able to take advantage of the beaconing that is now being enabled on the NI4CE NXDN repeaters, and it will auto channel steer your radio to the repeater that it hears the best. So if you've got, I'll take a real good example here. You've got the Verna repeater in Manatee County, the Laurel repeater in Sarasota County, and let's say the Charlotte North repeater in Charlotte County. There is a section of Sarasota County as well as Charlotte County where all three of those repeaters can be used. Some a little better than others, just simply because of ERP, antenna height, and physical proximity to wherever you are located. With your radio set up for zone operation or for voting operation in the zone, the radio will check those beacons that are transmitted every 10 seconds, and it will make a decision, independent of the operator, on which repeater it hears the best. If it's Verna, boom, it automatically goes to Verna. If it happens to be Charlotte South, but your radio previously had been on Verna, it will automatically switch to Charlotte South. No hands required. It just does it. And if for some reason you move to a different location, it may not have to be far, because where those repeaters start overlapping, yeah, it can easily change priority and change your primary repeater, by moving 100 feet. Again, it's all based on the received signal. So with voting set up in your zone, any channels that you have already programmed in that zone, if you're working with an existing code plug, that now becomes a voting situation. And you don't have to do anything else other than maybe make some adjustments to the specifications for what RSSI values it will actually use in the voting process. Excuse me. Let's skip down to that for just a second. So we'll go from memory channel and vote scan to scan and vote setting. So now we're going to open that up, and we've got several fields here that we're going to want to make some adjustments to. First of all, by default, you will have three values set for fast voting, vote L2, and revote. Those values are -100, -114, and -118. All right? Now, based on the layout of the infrastructure of the repeater system, that might work very well. And if you don't have a lot of overlap in your system design, fine, you can keep that. Based on where the repeaters are located and the amount of overlap in our NXDN network, we recommend that you change this -100 value here for vote or for fast vote to a -90. That should work well in most places. There may be one exception to that. If you are in Charlotte County, where there are 3 repeaters, you may want to set that to -85 or even -80. That will give you a little more granularity over which repeater you use. And if you're in Charlotte County, or if you're familiar with the landscape in Charlotte County, you have a repeater in Charlotte Harbor, literally right up the street from that big new beautiful resort that was built by Allegiant Airlines. You have another repeater a mile north of the county line and just west of US 41 at the Charlotte County landfill, and a third repeater that is on the north end of Babcock Ranch Village, which is the 100% solar-powered development over along State Highway 31 and just north of Fort Myers. Those are the 3 repeaters in Charlotte County, And if you are there on a extended basis, or you live there, or you get there often, you might want to change that minus 90 to a minus 85 or even a minus 80, just simply because you've got more RF and you're a much closer proximity to the repeaters. The vote 2 by default is minus 114. Now, if these were analog, minus 114 is mostly noise. By that time, you're basically out of the footprint or the effective footprint of just about every analog repeater. In NXDN, if you recall, NXDN decodes down to at least minus 116, and I've actually seen NXDN signals as low as minus 120 decode just fine. Just depends upon where you are. But here, we recommend making that minus 14 a minus 100 to 105. We're going to put 105 in there at the moment. There we go, minus 105. That's obviously a lower RF measurement or a higher RF measurement than what had been there previously. But again, we've got lots of repeaters. In some areas, that will work very well. In other areas, 105, if you're on the fringes, if you're over in Okeechobee and you're trying to hit the Lake Placid repeater, well, that's the only repeater that you can actually hit from Okeechobee, and you can hit it, by the way. So, that value wouldn't mean a whole lot, but as you drive west then on State Highway 70 and you start approaching US 27, well, you may start hearing some signal out of Arcadia. And as you keep going on 70, as you get into the heart of DeSoto County, well, you may be voting between Lake Placid and Arcadia, Lake Placid, Arcadia, and Verna, because there is that much overlap, particularly with a mobile signal. And finally, the revote, minus 118, well, that's really out of the range of what NXDN is supposed to decode at. So we're going to change that to a negative 114, because that way we still have a little bit of signal, but if you're at 114 and you've got potentially another repeater to go to, at least make the effort, or have the radio make the effort. Two other default settings that right now are off that we recommend that you turn on are fast vote. So we're going to turn that on. And we're also going to turn on revote after talk. And depending upon how long-winded you are, the revote after talk could potentially take you from where you were reasonably good into the designated repeater that you were on to it's time to go to a different repeater, particularly if you're long-winded like I am. So those are the 5 settings that by default we are going to program into radios that we program, and if you're going to do the programming yourself, we recommend that you make those changes. And for those of you who need a refresher on that, we did put all of those values into the PowerPoint presentation this morning, so download that from the ARRL West Central Florida section website and have it up on your computer. If you're programming from scratch, want to show you a couple of things that hopefully will save you some time, some angst, and some frustration. First of all, when you set your zones up, the only zone, and you'll notice right beneath where it says zone operation, it says 1. Well, that's your first zone. And the reason that's appearing rather than all 8 zones is that you must have at least one memory channel allocated for the zone to become visible. So if we go to the zone operations and you scroll all the way to the right, you'll notice under capacity, you've got 2 values. The first column is capacity, That's the total number of channels that will be in that zone. And then you've got used. Well, in zone 1, we have a capacity of 16 channels. That's there by default. First time, every time. Number of channels used, well, we haven't programmed any. Thus, we get the big old goose egg. Now, let's say we're programming 3 zones. Well, you can't program a zone unless you can actually see it and click on it and open it up. So in order to open up zone 2, we need to put a positive numeric value in there. Let's just put 6. All right, and in zone 3, we're going to also put a 6. And now we are going to scroll back all the way to the left and notice that over here in our left-hand pane, we now have 1, 2, and 3 visible to us. And if we go and click on them, we will be able to get in there, program, in the case of zone 1, up to 16 channels. In the case of zones 2 and 3, up to 6 channels. Now, where we have a number, any number, you actually can add to the 16 or detract from the 16, or add to the 6 or detract from it. Adding to it is really simple. Detracting, let's say you figure out when you're all said and done that you only needed 14 channels. That's all the memory channels you're going to need in that zone. Well, rather than take up or have 2 empty channels there, you can actually go back here to this zone operation screen, go back over to that capacity column, and reduce that number so that only programmed channels are available. Now, here's why that is uber important. First of all, if you've got any memory channels allocated that aren't being used, unless you're going to put something into that zone, you can't just take that and program some other memory channel. If you need to expand another zone, those channels are used, they're allocated. And in one case where we looked at a radio a little earlier today, we had a case of where all 128 channels are programmed so that when we add the next repeater, which may be in Hardy County sometime later this year, you're going to have to pull something out of there in order to free up a memory channel or 2 or 3, depending upon how many zones you want to put that repeater in. All right. Now, when we look at a zone, those are your empty memory channel slots. And you can put in your receive frequency, and I'll tell you what, let's put one in here, 442.1375. Okay, here's your trivia quiz. What repeater is on 442.1375? Anybody? I'll give you a hint. It's the closest repeater to this location. Right, Bartow is 442.1375. Well, in the scheme of things for UHF, if this radio is receiving the transmitted signal on 442.1375, what frequency should this radio transmit on? 447.1375. It's not automatic with any of these ICOMs. You can't just say, give it a plus offset or a negative offset. You physically have to put the frequency in there. And here's a good reason for that. NXDN has found its way into the marine world. Pardon me a second. In the marine world, the 5 megahertz offset doesn't work. It's not what the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which sets the standards for radio worldwide, that's not what the ITU has established for programming UHF radios for the Marine band. Their offset is 10 megahertz. So if you programmed a frequency of 457.400 for repeater output, your transmit output for the radio would be 467.400. And in one other case, again, this is maybe useless trivia, in the Marine world, the channels are not programmed or are not available with 5 digits to the right of the decimal point. For instance, we might have a frequency in amateur radio of 442.01875. And remember, NXDN is only a 6.25 kilohertz emission, so you can have a lot more channels there. In the Marine world, it's 6 digits to the right of the decimal. They divvy it up even more to create more channels. And you know what? If you're out in the middle of the Atlantic or the Gulf of America or the Pacific, and you're just out there, essentially, if you're on a yacht or a ship, you're an island unto yourself. And a lot of high-end yachts, a lot of merchant ships do use two-way radio with the operation of that craft. You might have a ship that's got 9, 10, 12 levels, and they need to be able to communicate from the deck to the engine room. They do those things on UHF. Okay? Now, we've programmed that in there. It's also going to want us to program a RAN code. Well, by default, number 1 is there. But there are 64 different RAN codes. We just happen to use one because that essentially was what early NX Core was set up on. So, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But again, that could be a completely different number. And know that a RAN code is the equivalent of a PL tone in the analog world. It's just simply a filter. All right. Now, as we scroll over to the right here, we talked about something else this morning. We called it lockout, and that's to prevent people from doubling and tripling and jumping all over each other, which is not a recommended operating practice, but it happens. We're only human. So if you wanted to lock this channel out when it's busy, meaning you can't transmit on it, if there's already a carrier there, you click the menu item and you select busy, which is your first option after off. Off is there by default, but select busy. And as far as the other options in this menu, disregard them at the moment. Just select busy. And if there is an RF signal on the air, you go to transmit, instead of getting beep beep, you'll get beep 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 beep. And if you press the push to talk button 2 or 3 times while that channel's busy, it will get your attention and it will become a little annoying. But it will also teach you some patience. So we're going to select busy lockout. If I can find my mouse cursor here. All right, one final column here that we do want to make sure we program, and that is the digital profile. Okay, let's talk about what the digital profile is. And to do that, we're first going to go to the call list, which by default will have 2 entries in it. One is an individual ID of 1, and one is a talk group ID of 1. Neither of them are named, but they're there. All right. So we know here in West Central Florida that talk group 1 is local. So we can add that label to it, and it's not local 4, it's just local. And it became 4 because I had my numerical lock on. All right, so we've now programmed a talk group. Yay! If we want to program another talk group, we go over to the call type and we select group. We put a number in there. And let's say we want to program the Florida talk group. What number should I put in there? 1200. And so that we're fully transparent and do not lose our minds. And I'm having trouble with my keyboard today. We're going to name that Florida. Now, when you are programming the digital profile, you've got to put in the talk groups that you want to create digital profiles for first. You can't just try and create a digital profile and assign it nothing. You'll get a big red X. So when you are programming your radio from scratch, recommend that you program your call list, or at least a foundation for your call list, first. Now that we've got two talk groups, we're going to go down here to digital, conventional, and profile. What better place to program your digital profiles? And notice that the first one is already programmed for us because we used a couple of things that were there. But now we want to create a new group. So we click on it. Remember I told you you would get red X's if you didn't have values in there? And the downside with a red X here or any place is that you'll never write anything into your radio until you correct the red X issue. So we're going to make our call list for individuals number 1, even though we haven't named it. And we're going to do the call list ID number. And now we have a menu of the call lists, or the talk groups rather, from the call list that we've programmed. So profile number 2 is going to be Florida. Now, this is a little more difficult to keep track of with the F2100 and the F6130, because when we go back to the memory channel to put all of that in, all it gives us is a number. If you're programming an F4400 or an F6400, you actually see not only the number, but the full name that you gave it in the profile. That makes it a whole lot easier. But now that we've got these created, we're going to go back over here now to Zone 1, and if we want to make this a local channel, we can do that. So what I'm going to do is scroll back over here now to the left hand, and in text we're going to put local. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to put L for local Bartow. Now, the second memory channel, we haven't programmed a thing yet. Now, we could do everything manually like I did the first time, but now that we've got something here, I can right-click and I can click Copy, so that when we go to create memory channel 2, I can right-click again and paste. And now the only two things I need to change are the text. So we're going to call this F-Bartow because it's the Florida talk group. And I'm going to go back over here to our digital profile. And because I want this channel to transmit on talk group 1200, which is digital profile number 2, I've just changed that to a 2. Now, with the way we've pre-programmed a lot of your radios, we set up the zones to mirror a particular talk group. We just figured that if you want to be on the Florida talk group and you're going from one repeater to another repeater and you want to stay on Florida, it's just easier to do it when all of your repeater options are in the same zone. That's not the only way you can program your radio. You can program your radio so that a site is your zone. It will, however, be a bit more limiting with the 2100 because you've only got 8 zones and we've got 13 repeaters. So, if you never touch another repeater that you haven't programmed, that's fine. But if you need to be able to touch any or all of the 13 repeaters, best to stay with programming your zones by talk group rather than by repeater. Now you'll see what we did here as well. And if we're programming this zone by talk group, we could have put a completely different frequency in there. Same RAN code, done the busy. We put in the digital profile for that particular zone, and we label it and save it. That zone's done. Well, what happens if the next zone, which happens to be zone 2, which now is again completely empty, what happens if we want to take the same repeater set that we've programmed in zone 1 and move it to zone 2? And maybe even populate zone 3 with it. Because after all, with 13 repeaters and multiple different talk groups, and if we're programming each zone by talk group, why should we have to type all that information in again? It's going to be the same for the most part. Well, what you saw me do with the copy and paste not only works within a zone, it also works interzone. So after I've programmed zone 1 with all 13 repeaters and maybe a couple of the simplex frequencies, I can copy that whole set of memory channels, move over to zone 2 and paste them. And they'll be identical to zone 1. So then if we've done that, and I'll tell you what, since I haven't done anything else, notice that we were able to do that, and I had only selected the one channel, so that's what was being held on my Windows clipboard. This is a Windows function. I could go ahead and do that across all 8 zones if I wanted to. So now all I have to change is the talk group name. So if we wanted to make this Skywarn, we use a T, and we learn how to type BARTOW. And so now this is the Skywarn channel almost for the second zone. And if we go back over here to our call list, we hadn't created Skywarn, so now we're going to, again, click on group. Skywarn is talk group 1299. We're going to put in Skywarn, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. And then we're going to go down to our digital profile, not our RAN channels, and we're going to create yet another profile. We'll put our individual ID and now our Skywarn talk group ID, and that's digital profile 3. So if I go back to 2 now, and I go over to the digital profile, and there we go. And we change that now to a 3. Well, now you get the gist of what we can do in terms of programming different zones, different talk groups, different channels. One of the keys to not losing your mind when you're programming your NXDN radio, I believe, is to program your talk groups in the call list first, create the digital profiles second, and then, unlike what I just did for you here, then go to these zones, create them, and that way you've already got the digital profiles created, and as you work through each memory channel, That's something you don't have to stop, go do, and then come back. It's already done. The other thing that it also does is that if your typing was perfect on the first zone and you're copying everything from the first zone into the second zone, into the third zone, and all you're doing is changing the label and the digital profile, you've saved yourself a lot of keyboard work and a lot of time. The bad news with that is if you have made a mistake in zone 1, you are copying the same mistake to zone 2 and zone 3 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got to go back and clean it all up. So before you start doing any copying and pasting, make sure that what you are wanting to copy and then move to some other zone is in fact perfect or as close to perfect as you're going to get. Now, if we had set zone 1 up as conventional, now that we've got, let's go back to zone 1 here. Now that we've got a couple of things in zone 1, all we have to do to make this a voting zone is go back to the zone operation and change the zone type. And why is my, oh, there we go, wrong one. Change the zone type from conventional to voting. It's that simple. So with your radios already programmed with conventional right now, if you want to change that to a voting zone, just go to zone operation, go to the zone type and change conventional to voting. You don't have to do anything else with your memory channels. One other thing I want to show you, which we alluded to earlier, and that is RX group. And now that we've got a couple of talk groups created, you might find that when you're in the local zone, where everything is set up on talk group 1, that even though that's the memory channel and zone you're going to be talking on or talking with, you want to be able to hear other things that may be going on that repeater, like any QSOs on Florida, or maybe more importantly, any traffic that is going on Skywarn. So let's say zone 1 is local, but we want to be able to monitor Skywarn simultaneously. So at that point, what we're going to do is we're going to turn on 2 of the 8 zones, or talk groups, I should say, that we can monitor. So number 1 says 1, but it actually should be 2 because we're monitoring a talk group. And the second talk group that we want to monitor is Skywarn, which is 3. So on this radio, when I'm in zone 1, I can talk and listen on talk group 1, which utilizes the Bartow only repeater or whatever repeater you're selected. But I also want to be able to hear or see any Skywarn traffic. Why did he say see? Well, if I'm using a radio where messaging has been enabled, and with our weather message app, or maybe something that's already built into memory with your radio, if there is a message that is sent out on 1299, even though I'm on a memory channel programmed to talk group 1, I want to be able to see that message or hear the announcement or the transmission on 1299. To enable all this, you just click the OK button, and now you'll notice that in the RX group, that has been turned on. And then in squelch type, right now there's no squelch by default. It's wide open, carrier access, but we want to choose selective. Selective squelch has 2 gates, the left gate and the right gate, or the dry gate and the water gate, but only if you're a politician. Hey, these are the freebies, folks. I can't speak to the quality. Anyhow, we've selected selective squelch. So that means that, number one, the transmitted signal must match the RAN code that this radio is programmed to, which is number one. Number two, since that memory channel is programmed to receive talk group 1 or talk group 1299 through RX group, it must be one or the other, or the squelch won't open. It's just that simple. If you have an older first generation radio, like your 4230, selective squelch does not have RX group available to it, so then you've got to set to RAN squelch. And then at that point, you've got no selectivity over what's heard, but you'll hear all talk groups that are transmitted on that repeater with that matching RAN code. This just makes it a bit better, a bit easier to manage. Any questions before we move on to a couple of other things? Yes. We could take what I've created here, dump it into a radio, and then we could program that same code plug with a couple of changes into another radio, into another radio, into another radio. They all have to be the same model, so the only thing you can do with the F2100 software is either an F2100D, a DS, or a DT. But you can't program, let's say, a 4400 with this code plug. And, you know, as most of you know, I've had my own two-way radio business. Last summer, before the hurricanes hit, I had a paying customer buy 450 radios, all of the same model. Now, they all weren't programmed absolutely identical, because a few went over here, a few more went over here, a few more went to a third place, so I had to change stuff, but I had lots of radios to program. So if you're going to do that, here's what you have to do, so as not to lose your mind and to make the radios useful. The code plug that you either have pulled up from a file or is already in a radio is going to have its own ID. It's not your ID, it's their ID. So you need to come over here and change the own ID. Then you can program that into the new radio. Almost. There's a couple of other things you want to change. If the code plug that you pulled in has the OTAA, or the over-the-air alias setup, and it may say, what's your call, KD0 or whatever, W4ABC, who, by the way, lives here in West Central Florida. His name is John Pearl. Let's say it's W4ABC, but your call is W4XYZ. Well, then at that point, you're going to come down here to the text field, and you're going to change W4ABC to W4XYZ. So that's the second change you're going to want to make. And then the third change is down here where it says user interface. Let me scroll down. Right there. You're going to go to key assign, and you're going to go to display. And right here on the very first item where it says opening text, and that's what you see as you turn your radio on, you're going to probably want to change W4ABC to W4XYZ. And then that way, when you turn the radio on the new radio, you're going to know that it's not W4ABC's radio, it's W4XYZ's radio. So those are the three changes you will want to make. There are other things you may want to change, you may want to add, you may want to delete, but right now you could load this code plug into a second radio. Any other questions? Let me show you one variant on this. You want to make sure that you go back to zone operations. And you see this column here, it's the third column where it says unit ID type. And by default, it's going to say own. So that means that the global ID that we had just put in here under own ID, that's going to be the ID that will be used in that zone. But you have options. You may make that type zone. And notice that over here in the unit ID field, where it says 12201 right now, it reverts back to number 1. It reverts back to a base default. Now, why on earth would you want to do that? Under most circumstances, you probably wouldn't. But I'm getting ready to do a demo at a major trade show where I'm going to be accessing 2 different repeaters, and on a certain talk group, they'll work in harmony. But I also want to be able to demonstrate that when I key up this repeater on another talk group, it only goes to that repeater. So that means I need an ID that will work with that repeater. Let's say 101, not 1101, 101. And let's say that I've created a second zone that goes exclusively to the second repeater. And I want to type in there 201. So when I'm over here working the first repeater, my radio says I'm ID 101, and that's how it's going to show up on any radio receiving that signal. But if I take my singular radio, go to a different zone, and I'm now going in on this repeater over here, my ID is now 201. So know that you can program the ID that the radio transmits either globally with own ID in each zone, or some combination of IDs that are zone specific or an ID that may be global. And for those of us who, may have a multitask for the radio. Let's say zone 1 is set up for NB9X, who's an Aries member, and zone 2 is set up for NB9X, who's a member of SARG or the Good Life Club. And my ID over here is not the same ID that I have over here. For example, in SARG, I'm called Ag 36. Over here in Skywarn, I may be 12201. That's how you can do it, and do it with the same radio. So before you do the cloning, just a precursor or word of caution, check the zone settings and make sure you don't have any channels that are set up for zone ID as opposed to own ID. Because if you've got that mix, going into that global own ID and changing the ID will not change everything. Okay. Now we showed you how to change the OTAA. By default, that beep beep that you get when you press the push to talk button is off. You have to activate it using TXRTT. When you turn it on, Now every time you press push to talk, beep, beep. Okay? And if you're not a fast reader and you want to make sure that you visually see who's calling you, you may want to change the extended display time from 3 seconds to maybe 4 or 5 seconds. I wouldn't go beyond 5.
What if I read slow?
Huh?
What if I read slow?
What if you?
If I read slow?
Oh, well, if the radio sends another, if your radio receives another ID, it just automatically overwrites the first one. Not a big deal. Alrighty. Now, one other thing I want to show you that plays into what we'll show you in just a moment is messages. By default, under Messages and Message Set, your RX on the 2100 is on. TX will depend upon whether you've programmed any messages in the message list, and then whether or not you've accessed or programmed a button to actually be able to access that message list to transmit what's ever in there. But you want to make sure that that's on. You've got lots of different ringers. What's a ringer? Well, it's a beep or a double beep or a quadruple beep. Or you'll notice down here we've got melodies. And then we also have melodies repeat. And some of your 2100s are programmed so that when you get a message, it goes bling, not beep, 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 or beep, 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 beep. It's a nice sounding sounder. It's not obnoxious. So just know that you can change that at will as well. Unfortunately, it's a one-size-fits-all, but bling as opposed to beep, beep, beep. I got to tell you, somebody asked me earlier about the TECHCON that I'm wearing now. Originally, if your TECHCON went into an alarm mode, either high or low, your phone would go beep, beep, beep. And while at 3 in the morning, if you've gone into a low situation, beep, beep, beep does get your attention. It also gets the attention of your wife or your kids or anybody else that's within earshot. And if you didn't catch it the first time, because maybe the first time you were a little bit groggy and you didn't quite respond fast enough, boy, by the time it comes around the second or third time, you're going to hear about it. And you're going to get a kick, right? Or a smack of some sort. So the new melodious sounders that have been programmed into the new TECHCON software are a godsend. Alrighty. We've talked about messages. And remember, when we put Zone 1299 into our RX group, even though we may have a memory channel activated for Zone 1, we're still going to receive voice traffic from 1299 and any message traffic on 1299. Well, that takes us over here to Weather Message. Weather Message is a Windows app that has been created by somebody that you've come to know and love, I hope, to help you utilize the text messaging capability of your NXDN radios and your NXDN communications. Let's face it, newer people coming into amateur radio today are already well versed in how to use their cell phones and their SMS texting, maybe to a fault, but they know how to do it. And so using a utility like Weather Message to send a message is second nature to them. It's part of the ever-evolving landscape of amateur radio. Because again, this is not your father's amateur radio, and it may not be his father's amateur radio or her father's. So Weather Message is here to do a couple of things. By the name itself, it suggests, well, our messages are going to be all about weather because it was created to be a tool for Skywarn and for severe weather spotting and to keep people abreast of what's going on with our environment. So let's say that I've got a severe thunderstorm warning. Turn things back on here. I press that enter key, and that message now has been sent out. And while it went out on talk group 1250, which is why your 1299 radios didn't respond to it, it's out there. And notice on the screen, it not only is in red, but when you receive the message, weather message is programmed to make that text bold as opposed to regular font face. So it's going to jump out at you. It's going to be really easy to read. There are various other color schemas that match what the National Weather Service and a number of other apps use. Tornadoes have a magenta background. Flash floods are in a lime green. Special marine warnings, a cyan. And there's one that will happen if Daryl over here turns on his F4400 and turns on the GPS capability of the radio and starts transmitting GPS positions. Sometimes, and particularly if you don't have a lot of GPS activity, you want to know who's transmitting that GPS packet. Well, Weather Message processes that message. It will show you who transmitted the packet, what time they transmitted it, and it will transmit the GPS sentence that contains the lat, the long, and several other pieces of GPS data. We've also written the hooks into Weather Message, so for the next release, I hope, or maybe one after that, we'll also be able to put up a window with a map and put that coordinate set on a map for you. Most days, you may not be interested in that information, but let's say you're involved in a search and rescue, or you're doing an event like the MS Bike Tour that's coming up on the 29th of March in the Sarasota-Bradenton area. They're looking for volunteers, by the way, and it will be on NI4CE Verna, analog and digital. Another one of those cheap plugs. So you want to track vehicles. You want to know where your SAG vehicle is. You want to know where your event director is. And if they're transmitting their GPS location, Weather Message is there to be able to digest it. And even after the fact, if you were wanting to look at something after the fact, you can take all of the coordinates that have been put into a ASCII delimited text file and then send them to an open map or a Google Street Map or whatever, or if you're really old school and had the software, Street Atlas, and all of a sudden you now have points of light on your map. I've got another app which I've written, which we use whenever we put a new repeater up. We want to see really what the coverage of that repeater is. So we activate GPS on talk group 1, tap directly into the repeater that we're testing, and that way we can catalog every 30 seconds, every minute, every 2 minutes, whatever the transmit interval is on the GPS, the location and the RSSI that was heard by the repeater. And then we can map out the repeater contour. It's a pretty handy utility. So Weather Message is here, and it does not have to be used exclusively for weather, which is why we set up Talk Group 1250. That way it gets the traffic off of Florida or any of the other talk groups. It puts it on a NXDN data talk group, and it can be used directly by Weather Message. All right, now you'll notice in the lower left-hand corner, right next to our weather message graphic, given to us by Sparky, that we have something there, a little white on black box that says Direct 125, which basically says I've got this program to work with the memory channel in this radio that I'm using that is set to the Direct 1 frequency in talk group 1250. If I click on the button just to the left, it will take me back through some other channels. So we've got Bartow, Verna, and Boyette programmed into our example today. And those are the channels that are programmed into our radio. And yeah, look, Ma, no cables. This is the radio the weather message running over here on this computer is using. And the data link is Bluetooth. Once again, proving that Bluetooth has more than one application. It's both voice and data. It's like country and western, or rock and roll. So what we've been able to do with weather message and our little buttons there is we've been able to programmatically channel steer your radio. So for this first message, we might want to program that and send it out on Direct 1250, but the next message we may want to send out through the Bartow repeater on talk group 1250. And at that point, it then goes to all of the NI4CE repeaters. And let's say maybe in this process, through no fault of our own or yours, the Bartow repeater goes down. Somebody ran into a light pole and the generator didn't spin up and the dog ate my homework. So now we're lucky enough we can get into the Boyette repeater. So we go back over here and we find Boyette. So now the next message can be transmitted through the Boyette repeater. Pretty cool. And I don't have to touch my radio, which is even cooler. Now, many of you use talk group 1 locally here in Polk County. Because why should you tie up all 13 repeaters when one will do? Well, just as you're talking on talk group 1, if you program a memory channel accordingly for data on talk group 1 and you program that into your settings file for weather message, then you can send messages on talk group 1 as well. And it only affects people on the Bartow repeater. So voice goes to voice, but data also goes to data. 1250 was the universal talk group that we created for general messaging across the repeater network, but you can message on talk group 1 or talk group 99. It just depends on how your radio is programmed and the settings you have put into weather message. I told you before this morning about forms, and we have an NTS form already built in. That's what it looks like. It's yellow in color, just like the NTS paper form. It has all of the fields of the NTS form, and you'll notice it also has one that isn't on the standard NTS form. It's the recipient email field. So if ultimately, after you have taken this NTS message from somebody and it goes up the line on NXDN to another station that may have internet, because you don't have internet right now, all you have is NXDN. Well, once it gets to that first or second or third amateur station where they now have internet and they now can send via email directly to the end recipient, instead of the message taking 4 days to get to its destination, it takes 4 seconds. in an emergency, in a disaster, in a situation where the people that you're trying to tell and communicate that we're okay, the house is gone, but we're okay, you have just set their minds at great ease without having to incur an extended amount of anxiety. So not only is this a time saver, it's also an anxiety saver, maybe a Xanax saver, or a Valium saver. Anyhow, this works. Once you have filled in all the blanks, you can save this if you can't transmit it immediately. So you do that, you can then come back, open it up, and then transmit it. It's pretty cool. And there may be other forms. I've had some requests to put together a couple of ITS forms, or ICS forms, I should say. We haven't gotten to it yet, but it won't be that difficult to create those and put those into WeatherMessage as well. Here you have a tool that can be used on any Windows 10 or 11 laptop, desktop, or if you've got a Intel-based tablet or a 2-in-1 computer, or it's a laptop that thinks it's a tablet, you can take WeatherMessage wherever you want to go. It's just that cool. And it's available on the ni4ce.org webpage. Just go to the NXDN page where you'll also see the NXDN system map. And in the lower left-hand corner, there'll be a button to click to download WeatherMessage. We also update the station list because as you go out and as new stations come on board and get their ID from radioid.net, well, that information needs to be updated. That too, periodically, usually once a month, can be downloaded from the ni4ce.org webpage and saved off as your stations.dat list. I've got one more thing I want to impart here today with everybody. The ni4ce system is something I'm pretty proud of, and I'm hoping at some point, even after I'm fertilizer, it will be part of my legacy here in West Central Florida. It's taken a bit of effort to get it going, a bit more effort to keep it going. Tomorrow afternoon, February 23rd, at 4:52 p.m., we will mark the beginning of the 25th year of service to West Central Florida. The 145-43 repeater went on the air February 23rd, 2001, from its first and only site at Verna. The 442.95 repeater followed 3 days later, only because we couldn't get out of our way on the 23rd. And they have been in continuous service. Tomorrow's our 24th anniversary, beginning our 25th year. We knew that as good as the Verna site is, that we needed more repeaters in order to cover all of West Central Florida, and certainly more to cover the entire county warning area for the National Weather Service office in Ruskin. We still haven't quite gotten there yet, but we do cover 14 of the 15 Ruskin counties and occasionally get into the 15th, both on analog and on NXDN digital. We're quite proud of it. It's a system that is purpose-built. When we started all of this out and knowing that Aries and Skywarn would be two of the prime users of this system, not to mention the EagleNet every night at 8:30, but I did. I guess that's kind of an extension of Aries, although Dave Rockwell won't admit it. The bottom line is we needed something that was going to be around here, not just when the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and the leaves are blowing. It had to be here when the leaves are really blowing and the sky is falling.
And Jim Cantori shows up.
No, Jim Cantori can't say that. However, somebody did say to me earlier that whenever we hear either Jim Cantori or me, they run because they know something's coming. But the bottom line is every one of our sites have emergency generator-based backup power or long-term batteries. We're even looking at solar for one of the sites. It's designed to withstand the storm. We can't control all of it. And I got to tell you, 3 years ago, in the aftermath of Ian, we came very close to losing not just the Verna repeaters, the entire site. They had two very old, very large oak trees, one that came down, fortunately, in the opposite direction from where the main power goes into the site. The second tree came down and missed one of the guy sets that holds that tower up by just a foot or two. And had it hit that guy set, it could have very easily reduced a 1,549-foot tower to a pile of rubble. And believe me, it ain't pretty. There was a tower up in North Florida, owned at that time also by Cox Media, that was brought down by a F3 tornado back in 2005, I believe it was. And that 1,549-foot tower literally crumpled in a heap. It's since been rebuilt, but, you know, it is what it is. We're really proud that we have been able to maintain the service in spite of all of the challenges. You are the reason that the NI4CE system exists. It's not just enough to put up a repeater. People have to be able to use it. And you do on a day-in, day-out basis. At the same time, without you and without your generous tax-deductible support, we wouldn't be able to keep things on the air. Because unlike what some people will tell you about our hobby, amateur radio isn't free. It does take some wheels that need greasing every now and then. So for those of you who do contribute on an irregular or regular basis, thank you. You've helped make necessary infrastructure for communications emergencies a reality. And if you want to contribute again, because the bills still come in, just go to the ni4ce.org webpage. We have several PayPal buttons there. Just press one, put your information in, and we will be very happy to say thank you. So with that, thank you all for coming here today, making TECHCON 2025, I think, a huge success. We look forward to Russ's post-production activity so that the slides and screens that we presented today will become really apparent and jump out at people who will look at this on the YouTube channel in a week or two. And if you're one of those folks, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for your interest in NXDN and for becoming part of a growing part of 2025 amateur radio. Thank you.